Hey guys, welcome back to part 2 of my review of the Canadian Protestant Experience. In this video, I will review the 3 remaining essays in this volume. The first essay I want to cover, which is the third essay of the book, is written by Phyllis Earhart and is called Ordering a New Nation and Reordering Protestantism, 1867 to 1914. So in this essay, Earhart argues that although the churches were initially apathetic to Confederation, thereafter they became acutely interested and intimately involved in the twin challenges of creating his dominion and winning the entire western frontier for Christ. She suggests that Protestant leaders led the search for national identity in many communities. Earhart contends that his dominion found practical expression in such things as missionary activities, reform movements, and voluntary societies. And it was in these practical expressions that the churches sought to meet the challenges of the era. These included rural depopulation, economic recession, rapid urban expansion, a new level of capitalism, new and poor labor conditions, and a slow chipping away at female stereotypes, to name only a few. A surge of immigration in the early 19th century meant that the churches tried to provide a Canadian identity for new immigrants under the auspices of helping them succeed in their new life in Canada. This work, which has often been called Canadianization or Canadianism, was rooted in the Church's conflation of Canadian and Christian identity. While this thesis statement seems compelling, and some of the facts she presents seem to support it, Earhart writes in a vague and confusing manner that makes it difficult to discern when she is in fact supporting her thesis and when she is merely stating a fact. Indeed, many paragraphs in the essay seemed entirely unconnected to those around it, even though there was a common topical thread. She simultaneously seems to show command of the subject matter while being unable to communicate it effectively and concisely, a seemingly contradictory predicament. Another weakness of Earhart's essay is that she suddenly and without explanation introduces a division into Canadian Protestantism along the lines of progressivism, which she favors, and traditionalism. Where this division came from, and even the contours of such a division, are left unexplained, leaving the reader somewhat bewildered as to the nature of this polarity and its meaning. Another issue is that when Earhart supplies examples, most, though not all, are from Methodist history, and only occasionally does she use examples from other denominations. Yet another weakness is her acknowledgement of the dissolution of the Protestant consensus, but if she explains this consensus, she disguises it well. She sees certain educational developments as indicating this lack of consensus as church colleges often merged into federated faculties under the direction of a public university. Now, this seems to imply that the dissolution was rooted in the apparent fragmentation of Protestantism which took place along modernist and fundamentalist lines, but her explanation is so convoluted it remains unclear to the reader. A strength, however, of Earhart's work is that she takes seriously the challenges facing the church, such as rural depopulation, urban growth, immigration, and capitalistic growth. And while much of her essay is unclear, she does show how the Church's vision of his dominion was practically expressed in attempts to meet these challenges. So the next essay I want to review, which is the fourth one in the book, is written by Robert A. Wright and is called The Canadian Protestant Tradition, 1914 to 1945. In this essay, Robert Wright argues that in the 3 decades following the Great War, the Canadian Protestant churches experienced not only a deterioration of the evangelical consensus, which had provided the basis for their cooperation in nation building, but also struggled to meet the challenges of a new modern Canada, as some churches appealed to tradition to meet challenges, while others saw innovation and experimentation as the best way to meet the new challenges. Wright describes the challenges faced by the Canadian churches as including a disillusionment with the Protestant notion that the war would usher in the millennium, disillusionment with the social gospel's vision, youthful rebellion, church membership decline, an increase in affluence, the modernist and fundamentalist controversies, and internationalism all brought challenges in the 1920s. In the 1930s, there was severe financial strain, the apparent collapse of capitalism, a surge of interest in democratic socialism, evangelical revival linked with the Oxford Group movement, and the growth of Protestant sects, many of whom Wright considers to be fundamentalist. Wright, however, correctly notes that religious and ethnic pluralism became an even starker feature of the Canadian religious landscape, due in part to immigration, but also largely due to the mainline denomination's ineffective response to many of the challenges of the interwar period. A major weakness of Wright's work is his unexplained and inconsistent division of Canadian Protestants into conservative, fundamentalist, liberal, and evangelical categories. At times, he uses these to qualify the label Protestant, but his choice is not explained and is inconsistent, so the reader is left wondering who exactly he is referring to. This matter also reveals an element of his bias. He seems to favor what he calls liberal Protestants, insofar as they seem to be the primary source of his examples and his description of the impact of events. He does, nearer to the end of the essay, devote a number of pages to the modernist fundamentalist controversies, as well as the growth of fundamentalism in Canada, but it remains a small part of his essay. Fortunately, Wright does attempt to define fundamentalism in the Canadian context. In his opinion, they are very similar to conservative evangelicals, which he does not define, but are different in that they emphasize the wrath of God, frame their worldview around premillennial and dispensational eschatological constructs, and are militantly opposed to modernism or any compromise with it. Wright's definition, though brief, seems to be accurate. The only problem is that his other labels, conservative, liberal, evangelical, remain undefined. It is possible that he believes he defines them in discussions of how the churches met the challenges of the time, but if he does, the definition remains largely unclear and unstated. An explicit definition would go a long way in clarifying his overall view of Protestant Christianity in Canada. The reason this is important is because part of his thesis is that the evangelical consensus that provided the basis for Protestant cooperation in nation building, and therefore in meeting the challenges presented during this period, lacks a definition, and the connections between evangelical and Protestant, conservative, liberal, and fundamentalist are not clearly presented. As a result, his thesis is vague and assumes a knowledge of this so-called evangelical consensus that seems to be really important for Canadian church history, but is not sufficiently explained in Wright's essay. The fifth and final essay in this book that I'm going to review is written by John Stackhouse Jr. and is called The Protestant Experience in Canada since 1945. In this essay, John Stackhouse Jr. argues that the Protestant Christianity appeared superficially the same in the late 1980s as it had in 1945, but that new patterns were developing under the surface as long-standing patterns disintegrated. More specifically, Stackhouse contends that the old religious patterns of mainline denominations, who wielded great influence over the public, and the so-called sectarian expressions of Protestantism which never received mainline status, were distinctions that came to be obsolete in the last half of the 20th century. The obsolescence of these patterns was, Stackhouse suggests, the result of not only the endurance of evangelicalism, but its growth in adherence, influence, and affluence. Stackhouse demonstrates that beginning in the 1960s, like-minded evangelicals from all manner of Protestant denominations began to cooperate together along various unofficial avenues. These evangelicals were motivated to cooperate with their like-minded colleagues, usually out of a dissatisfaction with their own increasingly liberal denomination or the apparent gains of secularism, as well as their long-held emphases on scriptural authority, personal conversion, and evangelism as central aspects of the Church's mission. The result of these shared interests and shared faith emphases was a trans-denominational movement that soon grew to command significant influence in the Canadian religious landscape. Stackhouse presents as evidence for this the birth and growth of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, new growth in the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, rising strength and popularity of Bible colleges, the establishment of Christian liberal arts universities, and a desire for graduate theological training, which produced numerous evangelical seminaries throughout the country. Stackhouse also presents statistical figures, mostly drawn from census data, that indicate the numerical decline of the mainline Protestant denominations and the growth of previously small and seemingly unimportant Protestant groups such as Pentecostals, Christian and Missionary Alliance, Fellowship of Evangelical Baptist Churches, Associated Gospel Churches, and the like. When Stackhouse refers to superficial religious patterns, he is implying the endurance of certain trends that have either been characteristic in Canadian church history or have at least had a lasting impact. One of these is, ironically, evangelicalism. The other is ecumenism. The former, evangelicalism, has been a major force in shaping Canadian culture and influencing Canadian society since the British conquest of 1760. The reason I call this ironic is because the four mainline Protestant denominations, Methodist, Presbyterian, Anglican, and Baptist, were each highly influenced by evangelicalism. Indeed, some of them were nearly synonymous with the movement. But in the mid to late 20th century, these denominations had become seriously distant from their former evangelical posture. While these old denominations declined while attempting to promote identities that tended toward liberal, traditional evangelicalism grew to be a serious force in Canadian Christianity. What is interesting is that, and often labeled conservative, denominations. This brings me to the second trend I mentioned above, ecumenism. Ecumenism has, since the ink dried on the British North America Act, been a major force in Canadian church history. As the mainline churches saw the potential for their role in shaping the new nation, they realized that national unity would be important. It was not long before the 6 Methodist denominations in Canada had consolidated themselves into one body. The same was true for Presbyterians and Baptists by the end of the 19th century. This trend continued, however, in tandem with the Church's vision of creating a Christian Canada and impelled some of these denominations to pursue a Church of Canada. This came into being with the merging of Canada's Methodists, Congregationalists, and a majority of Canada's Presbyterians into one United Church of Canada in 1925. Talks of union with other denominations and between other denominations persisted until the 1970s. This trend in the 20th century has been associated with theological liberalism and modernism, and it is well known that so-called conservative evangelicals looked askance at such unions and refused to countenance such a union. What is interesting is that these mainline denominations began to decline, and as they began to decline, ecumenism found a new life in the evangelical trans-denominational cooperation that Stackhouse discusses. Well, that's it for my reviews of the essays in this book. I hope they were helpful for you, and as always, thanks for watching, guys, and stay tuned for my next video.